The autumn of 1847 settled over St. Catherine's vicarage like a shroud, all copper leaves and dying light, the kind of season that makes poets weep and sensible men draw closer to their fires. Eleanor Ashford moved through this landscape of decay as though she were part of it, another withering thing awaiting winter's final mercy. The fabric of her mourning dress whispered against the stone floors of the vicarage with each step. Black crepe that had long since faded to a dusty charcoal, the hem frayed from years of trailing through graveyards and across chapel floors worn smooth by centuries of penitent knees. She was 28 years old, though the village spoke of her as though she were ancient, a relic of devotion, the perpetual widow that never was, who had given a decade to the memory of Thomas Hartley, her fiancé who had died 3 weeks before their wedding. 3 weeks. She had been fitted for her bridal gown, the ivory silk waiting in her wardrobe, when the news came that Thomas had been thrown from his horse on the road to London. She never wore that dress. Instead, she donned black, and she had not removed it since. The village of Ashbourne had long ago stopped expecting her to. They spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones, pointing her out to visitors as evidence of true devotion, of love that transcended death itself, though Eleanor knew the truth was far less noble. She wore black because she had forgotten how to wear anything else, because the weight of the fabric had become familiar, because stepping out of mourning would require a courage she had long since buried alongside Thomas in the churchyard. Her days followed an unchanging pattern, morning prayers with her father, the vicar, his voice echoing through the empty church while she knelt in the front pew, her hands folded over the prayer book Thomas had given her, then to the graveyard to tend the flowers on his headstone, pulling weeds from around the marble that read, Thomas Hartley, beloved son and devoted betrothed, 1817 to 1837. Afternoons teaching the village children their letters in the Sunday school room, her voice soft and patient as she guided small hands across slate tablets. Evenings reading scripture to the elderly and infirm, bringing them weak tea and weaker comfort. She moved through these rituals like a ghost haunting her own life, and if anyone had asked her when she had last felt truly alive, she would not have been able to answer. Outside the vicarage windows, the world blazed with autumn's final defiance, the oak trees turning gold and crimson, the hedgerows heavy with blackberries, the sky that particular shade of blue that only comes when summer has surrendered to the inevitable. But Eleanor saw none of it. She existed in shadow, in the perpetual twilight of grief that had become more home than prison, more identity than burden. She was the vicar's daughter who loved so truly she could not stop mourning. That was who she was. That was all she was. And she had long ago accepted that nothing would ever change. The Duke of Ravenmore arrived on a Tuesday, though Eleanor did not learn of it until the following Sunday, when the village could speak of nothing else during the social hour after services, their voices pitched low with scandal and fascination, the kind of delicious horror that comes from proximity to wickedness without personal risk. Sebastian Blackwood had inherited the Ravenmore estate from a distant cousin 2 years prior, but had never deigned to visit until now, preferring instead to remain in London, where his reputation had flourished like mold in darkness. Stories of gambling dens and opera singers and duels fought over matters of honor so dubious they barely qualified for the name. Mrs. Pemberton, the butcher's wife, clutched Eleanor's arm with flour-dusted fingers and whispered that the Duke had brought no servants from London, that he rattled about in that great house, with only old Henderson, the groundskeeper, for company, that he'd been seen walking the estate at night like some Gothic spectre. And wasn't it all terribly romantic and terribly wrong? Eleanor had murmured something non-committal and extracted herself from the conversation, thinking nothing more of nobility and their eccentricities, until her father summoned her to his study that evening with an expression that suggested duty was about to impose itself upon her carefully ordered existence. The Ravenmore estate possessed a chapel, her father explained, built in the 15th century and filled with ecclesiastical texts that had been neglected for generations, and the Duke had requested someone knowledgeable to catalogue and preserve them, and naturally the vicar had thought of his scholarly daughter who read Latin and Greek and had nothing but time to spare. Eleanor's immediate refusal died on her lips when she saw the set of her father's jaw, the way his fingers worried at the edge of his Bible, and she understood without words that this was not truly a request but an obligation wrapped in courtesy, that the Duke's patronage mattered to the church, that her father needed this favor granted. She wanted to scream that she could not, that the thought of leaving her routines filled her with a panic that tasted of copper, that she had not set foot in an unfamiliar place in years, but instead she heard herself agreeing in a voice that sounded nothing like her own, watched her father's relief bloom across his weathered face, and felt the first crack appear in the carefully constructed prison of her days. 2 mornings later, Eleanor walked the mile to Ravenmoor Estate, through fog so thick it turned the world to watercolor, her black skirts heavy with moisture, her heart beating an erratic rhythm against her ribs as the great house emerged from the mist, like something summoned rather than built. She found the chapel easily enough, a small stone building separate from the main house, its door unlocked and welcoming, and she had been examining the first shelf of crumbling volumes for perhaps 20 minutes, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find a man watching her from the doorway, with eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He was tall, elegant in the careless way of men who have never had to consider their appearance, his clothing expensive but rumpled as though he had slept in it, and there was something unsettling in the intensity of his gaze as it traveled from her face down to her mourning dress and back again. "Who are you mourning?" he asked without preamble, without introduction, his voice rough as though from disuse, and Eleanor found herself frozen beneath that scrutiny, her tongue thick and useless in her mouth, unable to form words, unable to look away, unable to do anything but stand there while Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenmoor, waited for an answer she could not give. Eleanor returned the following morning because duty demanded it, because her father's expectant gaze over breakfast left no room for refusal, because the alternative was explaining why the Duke's question had unsettled something fundamental in the architecture of her grief, and she had no words for that conversation. She arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, her spine rigid with determination to ignore whatever provocation the Duke might offer, to focus solely on the manuscripts that needed cataloguing, to treat this as the scholarly exercise it was meant to be rather than the intrusion it had become. But Sebastian Blackwood seemed to possess an uncanny ability to materialize wherever she was working, his footsteps silent on the stone floors, his presence announced only by the shift in the air that made the hairs on her neck rise in warning. He would stand in doorways watching her, or settle into a chair nearby with a book he never seemed to read, and after several days of this, Eleanor's carefully maintained composure began to fracture under the weight of his observation. "You wear your mourning like armor," he remarked on the 4th day, his voice cutting through the chapel's silence with the precision of a blade. "A fortress of black fabric to keep the world at bay." Eleanor's hands stilled on the Latin Psalter she had been examining, her jaw tightening against the response that wanted to escape. "You know nothing of my mourning, Your Grace." "I know it has become your prison," he countered, rising from his chair with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his dissolute reputation. "I know you hide behind it rather than honor anyone with it." The presumption of it, the sheer arrogance of this man who knew nothing of Thomas, nothing of love, nothing of the weight of loss that had shaped the last decade of her existence, sent fury coursing through Eleanor's veins like poison. She turned to face him fully, her prayer book pressed against her chest like a shield. "How dare you presume to understand what I feel, what I have endured? You, who by all accounts have spent your years in debauchery and excess, who wouldn't recognize genuine devotion if it struck you across your aristocratic face." Something flickered in his dark eyes, something that might have been pain or might have been recognition, but his voice remained steady, relentless. Devotion to what? To whom? This performance of loyalty to death rather than love of life serves no one, least of all the man you claim to honor. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, stealing her breath, because somewhere deep beneath the layers of ritual and routine, she knew he was right, knew that what she called devotion had long ago curdled into something else, something that looked more like cowardice than love. But knowing a truth and accepting it are vastly different things, and Eleanor felt herself fragmenting under the weight of this unwanted recognition, felt the careful walls she had built threatening to collapse. "You understand nothing," she whispered, her voice breaking, and then she was fleeing, her skirts tangling around her legs as she ran from the chapel, from the estate, from the Duke whose eyes saw too much, who spoke truths she had spent 10 years learning not to hear. She did not return the next day, nor the one after that, staying instead in the vicarage where everything was familiar and nothing challenged the comfortable numbness of her grief. But her father found her on the third morning, his expression kind but inflexible, and reminded her that she had given her word, that the work was not yet complete, that sometimes duty required us to face what made us uncomfortable. So Eleanor returned to Ravenmoor, her heart a clenched fist in her chest, returned to the Duke, who watched her with those knowing eyes, returned because she had forgotten how to do anything else but endure. Weeks passed, marked by the slow transformation of autumn into the skeletal beauty of early winter, and Eleanor returned to Ravenmoor Estate each morning with a formality so cold it might have frozen the very air between them. Her greetings to the Duke reduced to the barest civility required by her upbringing, her eyes fixed firmly on the manuscripts before her, as though they contained secrets more compelling than the man who watched her from across the room. But Sebastian Blackwood, she discovered, possessed a patience she had not anticipated in a man of his reputation, and rather than challenge her renewed defenses, he began instead to leave small gestures in his wake, like breadcrumbs on a forest path. A chair positioned by the window where the morning light fell warmest, a pot of tea prepared and waiting beside her usual workspace, though she had never mentioned her preference for it, a cushion placed on the hard wooden seat where she spent her hours bent over ancient texts. Eleanor told herself she noticed these things only because it would be rude not to acknowledge them, told herself the quiet, "Thank you," she murmured, was mere courtesy, but something in her chest loosened fractionally each time she discovered these silent kindnesses, these wordless acknowledgments of her presence and her comfort. It was on a grey afternoon in late October when she found him in the library rather than the chapel, seated in a leather chair with a volume of Wordsworth open on his lap, his dark eyes moving across the page with an absorption that transformed his face from its usual sardonic beauty into something gentler, more vulnerable. And Eleanor had paused in the doorway watching him, seeing for the first time not the rakish Duke of scandal and gossip, but simply a man reading poetry in the fading light. The rain came suddenly, as it often did in that season, sheets of water that turned the world beyond the windows into liquid silver, and Eleanor found herself trapped at the estate with no possibility of the walk home until the storm passed, and Sebastian invited her to sit by the fire in the library, an invitation she accepted because the alternative was standing awkwardly in the chapel's chill. They sat in silence at first, the crackle of flames and drum of rain the only sounds between them, until the Duke spoke quietly about his mother, who had loved poetry, who had died when he was 12, who had left a hole in his life that nothing had ever quite filled. And Eleanor listened with something shifting in her chest, some recognition that grief wore many faces and manifested in many forms. "How long ago did Thomas die?" he asked, his voice stripped of its usual challenging edge, and Eleanor found herself answering honestly for the first time. 10 years. The words falling into the firelit space between them, like stones into still water. Sebastian turned to look at her then, his expression unreadable but his eyes holding something that might have been sorrow or might have been understanding. And he said simply, quietly and without judgment or accusation, 10 years is a lifetime to give to the dead. And Eleanor felt the first real crack appear in the armor of her mourning, felt something long, frozen beginning, against her will and her fear, to thaw. As November fog settled over the countryside like a shroud, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and dreamlike, Eleanor found herself arriving at Ravenmoor Estate earlier each morning, her feet carrying her along the now familiar path, before her mind could construct reasons to delay. And she stayed later into the afternoon, long past when the cataloguing work required her presence, until the November darkness came early, and her father would worry if she did not return before the lamps were lit in the vicarage windows. The conversations between her and the Duke had shifted, subtly at first, and then with gathering momentum, from their initial antagonism into something deeper, more philosophical, discussions about the nature of grief and duty, and what it meant to truly live rather than merely exist. And Eleanor discovered that Sebastian possessed a mind as sharp as any scholar's, that beneath his rakish reputation lay a man who had read widely and thought deeply about questions that most of society's darlings never bothered to consider. It was during one of these conversations, as they sat in the library with weak winter sunlight slanting through the mullioned windows, that Sebastian told her about his father, the previous Duke, a man whose cruelty had been legendary within the family, even if the world saw only aristocratic dignity. A man who had beaten his son for perceived weakness and locked him in cellars for imagined disobedience, who had driven his gentle wife to an early grave and then blamed his son for not being strong enough to save her. Eleanor listened with her heart breaking for the boy Sebastian had been, understanding suddenly that his scandalous reputation was not merely the result of aristocratic excess, but a carefully constructed shield, that the debauchery and dissolution were partly deserved and partly deliberate, a way of ensuring that no one looked too closely at the wounded man beneath the libertine's mask, that everyone saw exactly what he wanted them to see, and nothing of the truth underneath. "I ran to London," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than on her face, "because I could not bear to stay in places that reminded me of him, of her, of everything I had failed to prevent or protect, and I built a life of sensation and scandal, because feeling anything, even degradation, was better than feeling the emptiness that waited in the quiet moments." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some recognition that they were both prisoners of their pasts, both hiding from truths too painful to face directly, both using their chosen prisons, her mourning and his dissolution, to avoid the harder work of actually healing, actually living, actually allowing themselves to be vulnerable enough to love again. She had been reaching for a volume on the shelf at the same moment he did, their hands meeting on the leather spine, and neither of them pulled away, their fingers touching in that small space between the books, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the warmth of his skin against hers, felt something long dormant stirring in the depths of her being, something that felt dangerously like hope, terrifyingly like desire, impossibly like the beginning of love. But with that stirring came guilt, swift and sharp as a blade, because how could she feel alive in Sebastian's presence when Thomas lay cold in the churchyard? How could she allow herself to anticipate these daily meetings when she had vowed to honor Thomas's memory with eternal fidelity? How could she betray the dead by daring to want something for herself, to want the future instead of the past, to want the warmth of a living hand instead of the cold comfort of memory? She pulled her hand away as though burned, saw the flicker of hurt cross Sebastian's face before he masked it with his usual sardonic expression, and she fled the library with some excuse about the lateness of the hour. But that night, she lay awake in her narrow bed at the vicarage, her traitorous heart remembering the touch of his hand, her awakening soul whispering that perhaps, just perhaps, 10 years of darkness was enough. The December morning arrived cold and crystalline, frost painting elaborate patterns on the vicarage windows, and Eleanor walked to Ravenmoor estate with her usual measured pace, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, her black skirts whispering against the frozen ground, entirely unprepared for what awaited her in the gardens behind the great house. She saw the smoke first, a dark plume rising against the pale winter sky, and her steps quickened with concern that perhaps some accident had occurred, some tragedy that required assistance. But as she rounded the corner of the estate, she stopped, as though she had walked into an invisible wall, her mind struggling to comprehend the scene before her. Sebastian stood beside a bonfire built in the center of the formal garden, flames already crackling and reaching toward the morning sky, and piled beside the fire in a heap of black fabric were her mourning dresses, every single one of them. The garments she had mentioned storing in the estate's unused servants' quarters during the renovation work her father was having done at the vicarage, and the dresses that represented 10 years of her life, her penance, her prison, her protection against a world that demanded she feel and live and choose when she had believed herself incapable of all three. "What have you done?" Eleanor heard herself say, her voice emerging strange and distant, as though it belonged to someone else entirely, and Sebastian turned to face her with an expression that held no apology, no regret, only a fierce determination that made something in her chest constrict with equal parts fury and fear. "What I should have done weeks ago," he said, his voice steady and certain. "What someone should have done years ago, what you would have done for yourself if grief had not convinced you that you deserved to live in perpetual shadow." Eleanor's shock crystallized into rage, white-hot and purifying, and she moved toward the pile of dresses with her hands outstretched, as though she could somehow protect them, save them, preserve the familiar weight of her mourning. "You had no right," she cried, her voice breaking on the words, tears already streaming down her face, though she could not have said whether they were tears of anger or anguish or something more complicated that she had no name for. "Those are mine, my choice, my grief. You cannot simply destroy them as though they mean nothing. Sebastian stepped between her and the dresses, his tall frame blocking her path, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that matched her own fury. "I have every right," he said, his voice low and passionate. "I have every right to refuse to watch you bury yourself alive, to refuse to stand silent while you waste the precious gift of your years in worship of death, to refuse to pretend that what you are doing is noble when it is nothing more than cowardice, dressed in the respectable garments of grief." The words struck her like physical blows, and Eleanor felt something inside her crack wide open, felt the careful structure she had built around her pain begin to crumble, and before she could stop herself, before she could think or reason or retreat into familiar numbness, Sebastian reached down and lifted the first dress, black bombazine that she had worn to Thomas's funeral and every day since, and threw it into the flames, where it caught and burned with a brightness that seemed to illuminate every shadow she had been hiding in for the past decade. Eleanor lunged toward the fire with a cry that tore from her throat like something feral and wounded, her hands reaching for the remaining dresses as though she could somehow pull them back from the inevitable, but Sebastian caught her around the waist and held her back, his arms iron bands that she struggled against with a strength born of desperation and fury, her fists beating against his chest as she screamed at him to let her go, to stop this madness, to restore what he had no right to destroy. "They are just fabric," he shouted over her cries, his voice raw with emotion as he held her thrashing form. "Just cloth and thread, Eleanor. They are not Thomas. They are not your love. They are not your loyalty. They are nothing but the bars of a cage you have built around yourself." She fought him with everything in her, kicking and clawing like a wild creature. But he was stronger, and he held fast, and when she could not break free, she could only watch in horror as he reached with one hand and threw another dress into the flames, then another, the black fabric catching and curling and turning to ash while she sobbed and screamed and felt as though her very soul was burning with them. "I am watching you waste away in worship of a ghost," Sebastian said, his voice breaking now, his own face wet with tears, though whether they were for her pain or his own anguish, she could not tell. "And I cannot bear it, Eleanor. I cannot stand by and watch you sacrifice your life on the altar of the past when you have so much living left to do, so much love left to give, so much beauty waiting to bloom if you would only let yourself live." Something inside Eleanor shattered at those words, some final barrier that had been holding back a decade of suppressed emotion, and the screaming turned to weeping, deep wrenching sobs that shook her entire body, and her legs gave way beneath her, so that if Sebastian had not been holding her, she would have fallen to the frozen ground. He sank down with her, still holding her close, and she buried her face in his chest and wept as she had not wept since the day they buried Thomas, wept for the young man who had died too soon, for the girl she had been who believed the world would end with his death, for the 10 years she had lost to grief that had long since curdled into something else, something that was more about punishing herself than honoring him, more about hiding from life than celebrating what they had shared. The dresses burned, one after another, the flames consuming the black fabric with a hunger that seemed almost holy, and Eleanor grieved not just for Thomas now but for herself, for the lost decade, and for the woman she might have been if she had allowed herself to heal, if she had chosen life instead of this slow death dressed in mourning weeds. And Sebastian held her through it all, his arms strong and steady around her shaking form, his own tears falling into her hair as the winter morning brightened and the smoke rose like prayers into the pale December sky. The weeping eventually subsided to quiet trembling, Eleanor's body exhausted from the violence of her grief, and she remained curled against Sebastian's chest as the fire burned down to embers, the last of her black dresses reduced to ash that scattered on the winter wind, and she felt hollowed out, scraped raw, as though every emotion she had suppressed for 10 years had been torn from her body and left her empty and aching, and strangely, impossibly lighter. Sebastian held her in silence, his arms still wrapped around her shaking form, and when the cold finally penetrated her awareness, he gently removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders, the fabric still warm from his body and smelling of sandalwood and something indefinably him. And Eleanor pulled it closer with trembling hands, grateful for the warmth, for the solid presence of him, for the fact that he did not demand she speak or explain or apologize for the storm of emotion that had just torn through her. They sat together on the frozen ground as the morning brightened, the December sun pale and distant, and finally Eleanor found her voice, raw and broken but her own. "It was my fault," she whispered, the words she had never spoken aloud in 10 years, the confession that had lived like poison in her heart. Thomas's death, it was my fault, we argued that morning, a foolish disagreement about something I cannot even remember now, and he left angry, rode out angry, and the horse threw him and he struck his head on a stone and he never woke, and if I had not argued with him, if I had let the matter rest, if I had been kinder, more patient, more loving, he would have lived. Sebastian's arms tightened around her, but he said nothing, waiting, and Eleanor continued, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. "I believed I deserved no happiness after that, no joy, no color, no life," she said, her voice shaking but steadier now. "I believed that mourning was my penance, that if I grieved long enough, visibly enough, perfectly enough, it might somehow atone for my failure to love him better when he lived. And the years passed, and the mourning became who I was, the perpetual widow, the vicar's tragic daughter, and I did not know how to be anyone else, did not believe I had the right to be anyone else." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving in slow circles on her back, and when he spoke his voice was gentle but firm, the voice of someone who understood guilt's terrible weight. "Eleanor, look at me," he said, and she raised her head from his chest, her eyes swollen and red, her face blotched with tears, and met his gaze, dark and infinite, and filled with a compassion that made her throat tighten. "Every argument, every crossword, every moment of impatience between two people who love each other does not carry the weight of life and death," he said, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away fresh tears. "Thomas's death was a tragic accident, a moment of cruel fate, and you have punished yourself for a decade for the simple crime of being human, of having been less than perfect in a moment that you could not have known would be your last. And I tell you now, with all the certainty in my soul, that you did not deserve this prison you have built, this half-life you have accepted as your due." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest at his words, felt the terrible knot of guilt that had lived beneath her breastbone for so long begin, just barely, to unravel, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her breath shuddering, and whispered, "I do not know how to forgive myself." 3 days passed before Eleanor could bring herself to leave the vicarage. 3 days, during which she remained in her room, wrapped in blankets and grief, and the strange hollow lightness that came after a storm. And on the morning of the 4th day a package arrived, delivered by one of Sebastian's servants, with instructions that it was to be opened in privacy, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she untied the string and pulled back the brown paper to reveal fabric the color of twilight, a dress in deep plum that was neither the black of mourning nor the bright hues of celebration, but something in between, something that whispered of transition and tentative steps toward a world she had abandoned a decade ago. She lifted the dress with shaking hands, held it against herself before the mirror, and felt terror rise in her throat like bile, because this was the threshold she had never dared to cross, the boundary between the prison of her grief and the vast unknown territory of living. And she thought of the village seeing her in color, thought of their whispers and judgments, thought of standing in church without the armor of her mourning dress to shield her from the world's expectations, and she nearly folded the dress back into its wrapping and hid it in the bottom of her wardrobe, where it could not accuse her of betrayal. But Sebastian's words echoed in her mind, his raw confession that he could not bear to watch her waste away, and she thought of Thomas, tried to imagine what he would say if he could see her now, if he could see the decade she had given to his memory, and she knew with a certainty that settled like peace in her bones that he would not want this, would never have asked for this sacrifice of her life upon the altar of his death, would have wanted her to live and love and fill her days with something other than the tending of his grave and the cultivation of sorrow. Sunday morning arrived cold and bright, the December sun glinting off frost-covered fields, and Eleanor dressed with fingers that fumbled at buttons and trembled over fabric, the plum dress settling around her body like a foreign skin, and she stared at her reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back, pale and wide-eyed and terrified but undeniably, impossibly present in a way she had not been for 10 years. The walk to street, Catherine's felt like a journey of miles, though it was barely a quarter hour, and Eleanor was conscious of every eye that turned toward her, every whisper that followed in her wake, the village's shock palpable as they beheld the vicar's daughter in something other than unrelenting black. And she kept her gaze fixed forward, her chin raised, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles went white, and when she entered the church, she felt exposed and raw, as though she had come naked before them all. She took her customary seat in the front pew, her father already at the altar preparing for the service, and she could feel the weight of the congregation's stares boring into her back, could hear the rustle of whispered speculation, and she wanted desperately to flee, and to run back to the vicarage and tear off this dress and hide herself again in the safe anonymity of mourning. But then the church door opened, and Sebastian Blackwood entered, the Duke of Ravenmore attending Sunday service for the first time since his arrival in the village, and the whispers crescendoed into barely suppressed gasps as he walked down the center aisle, with his dark hair catching the light from the stained glass windows and his eyes searching until they found her. Their gazes met across the length of the church, his expression unreadable but intense, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, felt the terror begin to recede beneath a warmth that spread through her like sunrise. And when Sebastian took a seat 3 rows behind her, when he offered her the smallest of smiles, private and knowing, and filled with such profound understanding that her eyes burned with tears, Eleanor smiled back, a tremulous, uncertain thing, but real, genuine, the first smile of true hope she had allowed herself in a decade. And she turned to face the altar, knowing that something had shifted irreversibly, that she had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, and that perhaps that was not a tragedy but a kind of salvation. As winter deepened over the countryside, the days growing shorter and the frost lingering well into morning, Eleanor returned to Ravenmore Estate to continue her cataloguing work, but everything had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The library that had once felt like a battleground, now seeming more like a sanctuary, and Sebastian no longer prowled the space with restless energy, but instead settled into companionable silence beside her, reading while she worked or occasionally asking her opinion on some volume he had discovered, and their conversations stretched longer now, ranging from the philosophical to the deeply personal, discussions about poetry and faith, and the nature of grief that lasted through the afternoon and into evening, until the winter darkness pressed against the windows, and Eleanor realized with a start that hours had passed without her awareness. He courted her with a care that bordered on reverence, seeming to understand instinctively when to press forward and when to give her space to breathe. And there were shared meals in the estate's dining room, where candlelight caught in crystal and silver and made everything seem suspended outside of time, and walks through the frost-covered gardens, where their breath formed clouds in the cold air, and the world felt hushed and waiting, and Eleanor found herself arriving earlier each day and staying later, drawn by something she could not quite name, but felt settling into her bones like warmth after a long chill. One afternoon, as they stood together examining an illuminated manuscript, their shoulders nearly touching as they bent over the delicate pages, Sebastian reached past her to point out a particular detail in the marginalia, and his hand brushed against hers, a touch so brief it might have been accidental, but Eleanor felt it like electricity through her entire body, and when she turned her head slightly, their faces were mere inches apart, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes and count his individual eyelashes. And for a heartbeat the world held its breath. But then Eleanor stepped back, her cheeks flushing, her hands trembling as she returned her attention to the manuscript, and Sebastian said nothing, did not push or demand, simply gave her the space she needed, while remaining close enough that she felt the warmth of his presence like a promise. The village gossip intensified with each passing week, whispers following Eleanor through the marketplace and knowing glances exchanged at Sunday service, and Mrs. Henderson, the butcher's wife, made a pointed comment about young women who forgot themselves in the company of rakish noblemen, and Eleanor felt the familiar shame rising in her throat, but pushed it down, refusing to let their judgment diminish what was growing between her and Sebastian, though she could not deny the flutter of anxiety when her father called her into his study one evening, his expression grave, and asked her directly about the nature of her relationship with the Duke. Her father's concerns were not unfounded, Eleanor knew, for Sebastian's reputation had preceded him to this quiet corner of England, tales of London scandals and gaming hells, and women of questionable virtue, and the vicar spoke carefully but firmly about the dangers of a man who lived according to no law but his own pleasure. And Eleanor listened with her hands folded in her lap, her heart beating hard against her ribs, but when he finished, she met his eyes steadily and said, "He is not what they say he is, Father, or perhaps he was once but is no longer, and I know you wish to protect me, but I am not the fragile creature you fear I am, not anymore." And she saw surprise flicker across her father's face, followed by something that might have been respect or perhaps simply resignation, and he said only, "Be careful, Eleanor. Hearts once broken do not mend the same way twice." And she nodded, knowing the truth of his words, but knowing also that she had already made her choice, that when Sebastian had taken her hand during their walk yesterday, and she had not pulled away, had instead let her fingers intertwine with his and felt the rightness of it settle into her soul, she had crossed yet another threshold from which there could be no return. The battle within Eleanor's heart raged through the following weeks with an intensity that left her sleepless and restless, pacing her room in the small hours of the morning, while the village slept and the winter wind howled against the vicarage windows, and she found herself caught between the warmth of what she felt when Sebastian looked at her with those dark eyes that saw through every defense she had ever constructed, and the cold grip of guilt that whispered she was betraying Thomas's memory, that she had no right to this emerging happiness when he lay cold in the churchyard, that to love again was to diminish what they had shared in those brief months before his death. One frost-bright morning in late December, Eleanor wrapped herself in her warmest cloak and walked to street. Catherine's churchyard stood before Thomas's headstone with its weathered inscription and the winter-dead flowers she had placed there weeks ago, and for the first time in 10 years she spoke to him honestly, not in the careful platitudes she had offered during her daily visits, but in raw truth that trembled from her lips like confession. "I am so tired, Thomas," she whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Tired of carrying this weight, tired of punishing myself for an accident that was no one's fault, tired of being half alive when the world continues to turn and seasons continue to change, and I am still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling things I thought had died with you." She knelt in the frozen grass, her fingers tracing the carved letters of his name, and continued, "I blamed myself because it was easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things happen without reason or justice, and I wore black because it gave me a purpose when I felt purposeless, and I tended your grave because it was the only way I knew to prove that I had loved you, that I still loved you. But Sebastian was right, Thomas. It became a prison, and I do not know if you would recognize the woman I have become, this shadow who forgot how to laugh or hope or imagine a future beyond the next Sunday service." The tears came then, freezing on her cheeks, but they felt different from the tears she had shed for a decade, less like grief and more like release, and she thought about the Thomas she had known, full of life and energy and plans for their future together, and she knew with a certainty that settled like peace in her bones that he would not want this, would be horrified to know that she had sacrificed 10 years to his memory, would urge her toward the life that Sebastian was offering her with patient hands and understanding eyes. Eleanor remained there until her knees went numb and her fingers lost feeling, and when she finally rose and turned back toward the vicarage, she stopped at the gate and removed the mourning brooch that had pinned her collar closed for a decade, the jet stone cold against her palm, and she placed it carefully on Thomas's grave like an offering, a symbol of what she was choosing to leave behind, and she whispered, "I will always love what we were, Thomas, but I choose to love what I might become," and walked back through the village with her head high and her collar unpinned and a lightness in her step that felt like the first thaw after an endless winter. And when she arrived at Ravenmoor Estate that afternoon, Sebastian took one look at her face and smiled, said nothing about the missing brooch or the tears still dried on her cheeks, simply took her hand in his and held it while they sat together in the library's warmth, and Eleanor felt herself crossing yet another threshold, choosing not merely to survive her grief but to truly, finally, courageously live again. The declaration came on a January afternoon when sleet tapped against the library windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the spines of ancient volumes, and Eleanor was cataloguing a collection of theological texts when Sebastian set down his book and crossed the room to where she stood, and something in his movements made her pause, her hand stilling on the leather binding she had been examining, her heart beginning to race even before he spoke, and when he said her name, just Eleanor, in that low voice that seemed to reach into her very soul, she turned to face him and saw in his eyes an intensity that stole her breath. "I have tried to be patient," he said, his words measured but weighted with barely contained emotion. "Tried to give you time and space to find your own way forward, but I find I can no longer remain silent about what has been burning in my heart since the first moment you stood in this very room and looked at me with those eyes that held entire oceans of sorrow. And I must speak now, or go mad with the keeping of it. Eleanor, I love you. I love you with a depth and certainty that terrifies me, for I have never been a man who believed himself capable of such feeling, and yet here I am, utterly undone by a woman who wore black for a decade, and taught me that the bravest thing a person can do is choose to live again." Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, each one landing in the tender places she had tried so hard to protect, and fear rose in her throat, choking and immediate, for she had forgotten how to be loved, had spent so long in the cold comfort of grief that the warmth of his declaration felt dangerous, foreign, like learning to walk after years of paralysis. "I do not know if I remember how," she whispered, her voice breaking, "how to love, how to be loved, how to be anything other than what I have been for so long, Sebastian. I am afraid I will fail you, that I am too broken to be what you deserve." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. They could see the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for her, and he said with such tender conviction that it brought tears to her eyes, "Then I will teach you to remember, Eleanor. I will teach you with patience and devotion every day of our lives, for love is not something you have forgotten but something you have been afraid to feel, and I am willing to wait, to move at whatever pace you need, and to prove that you are not broken but simply wounded, and wounds, given time and care, can heal." But before Eleanor could respond, before she could articulate the complex tangle of hope and terror coursing through her veins, the library door opened, and her father stood in the threshold, his expression grave and troubled, and Eleanor saw in his face that he had heard at least some of what had passed between them, and the vicar's voice when he spoke was heavy with concern and paternal authority, as he said, "Your Grace, might I have a word with my daughter privately?" And Sebastian bowed, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face, before withdrawing from the room with a grace that belied the tension crackling in the air. Her father waited until Sebastian's footsteps faded down the corridor before turning to Eleanor, with eyes that held both love and worry, and he spoke carefully, measuring each word, about the Duke's unsuitability, his scandalous reputation in London society, the talk already spreading through the village like wildfire, the concern that Eleanor was vulnerable in her recently awakened state and might be making decisions born of gratitude rather than genuine affection. And Eleanor listened to each argument with growing frustration, for she understood her father's fears, but felt also the stirring of something new within her, a fierce protectiveness, not just of Sebastian but of her own right to choose her own path forward. When her father paused for breath, Eleanor drew herself up to her full height and met his eyes with a steadiness she had not possessed even days ago, and she said, her voice quiet but unyielding, "Father, I know you wish to protect me, and I am grateful for your love and concern, but Sebastian is not what the gossips claim, or if he was, he has transformed just as I have transformed, and I will not retreat back into the safety of grief simply because others judge my choices or because love seems dangerous after so long in numbness. For the first time in 10 years I feel truly alive, and I will defend that with everything in me, even if it means disappointing you, even if it means facing the village's censure, for I have learned that sometimes the most courageous act is not enduring suffering but choosing joy." Sebastian found Eleanor in the winter garden the following evening, when twilight had turned the snow-laden branches to silver and purple shadows, and she stood among the bare rose bushes, wrapped in a cloak the color of deep wine, no longer black but not yet the vibrant hues she might someday wear. And when he approached, she turned to him with eyes that held questions she had not yet voiced, and he said without preamble, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, "There is something you must know about me, Eleanor, Something I have not told you because I am a coward despite all my bold words about courage and living, and if we are to move forward together, you deserve to know the truth of why I fled London for this forgotten estate, why I returned to a place I swore I would never set foot in again." She waited, her heart beating faster, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal would change things between them, would either draw them closer or create a chasm too wide to cross, and Sebastian ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of agitation she had never seen from him before, and began to speak in a voice rough with emotion about a man named James Thornbury, who had been his closest friend since their school days at Eton, a friendship forged in shared rebellion against cruel fathers and the suffocating expectations of their class, and how, in London's glittering ballrooms and dark gambling hells, they had carved out a reputation for wildness that was partly performance and partly escape from the pain they both carried. James was reckless, Sebastian continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the garden walls, reckless in a way that frightened me even as I enabled it. And one night last spring, we were deep in our cups at a card game that had gone on too long, with stakes that had climbed too high. And James lost everything, his quarterly allowance and his mother's jewelry which he had no right to wager, and when the winner demanded payment immediately, James stumbled out into the street in a rage and I followed, but not quickly enough, not carefully enough, for I was drunk myself, and when he climbed into his curricle swearing, he would ride to his estate and fetch the money that very night, though it was past midnight, and the roads were dangerous. I laughed. "Eleanor," I laughed and told him to go prove himself a man, and he drove off into the darkness, and I returned to the card table, and 3 hours later they found his body in a ditch with his neck broken and his curricle shattered against a tree. The confession hung between them like something physical, and Eleanor saw in Sebastian's face the same guilt she had carried for 10 years, the same conviction that he was responsible for a death that perhaps could not have been prevented. And she understood with sudden clarity that they were both prisoners of their past, both wearing mourning garments of different kinds, both punishing themselves for accidents and choices that had spun beyond their control, and instead of recoiling from his revelation, she stepped closer and took his cold hands in hers, and said with a gentleness born of shared suffering, "You see now why I understood your grief so completely, why I could not bear to watch you waste your life in penance, for I have been doing the same, Sebastian. We have both been dying by degrees to honor the dead, but perhaps we can save each other, perhaps two broken people can become whole together." And when he looked at her with eyes bright with unshed tears, she lifted her hand to his face, and he bent his head to hers, and they kissed in the winter garden with the snow, beginning to fall around them like benediction, a kiss that tasted of tears and forgiveness, and the tentative hope that healing might be possible after all, that two souls who had spent so long in darkness might find their way toward light together. And Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the bands that had constricted her heart for a decade, and she knew that their mutual brokenness was not weakness, but the very foundation upon which they might build something enduring and true. As Christmas approached, and the village prepared for the season of joy and redemption, the whispers that had begun as mere curiosity hardened into something darker and more judgmental, for the sight of Eleanor Ashford walking through the snow-dusted lanes in her plum-colored dress, instead of funeral black, had scandalized the more conservative parishioners who saw in her transformation not healing but betrayal, and Mrs. Weatherby, the butcher's wife who had appointed herself moral guardian of the parish, began a quiet campaign of concern that spread like winter frost, suggesting to anyone who would listen that the vicar's daughter had been corrupted by the Sinful Duke, that grief had made her vulnerable to manipulation, that her poor father must be beside himself with worry over his daughter's association with a man whose London reputation was so thoroughly stained with scandal and vice. Eleanor felt the weight of their disapproval in the turned heads and whispered conversations that ceased when she entered shops, in the pitying looks from women who had once sought her counsel, in the parents who suddenly found reasons their daughters could not attend her Sunday school lessons, and though she had expected judgment, she had not anticipated how it would feel like a physical pressure against her chest, making it difficult to breathe, tempting her to retreat back into the safety of mourning, where at least she had been respected, even if she had not been truly alive. and she found herself standing at a crossroads between the familiar prison of grief and the terrifying freedom of choosing her own path forward, regardless of others' opinions. Sebastian sensed her struggle during one of their afternoon meetings in the library, saw the tension in her shoulders and the shadows returning to her eyes, and he set down his book and came to her and said with a gravity that made her heart clench, "Eleanor, I will not be the cause of your suffering or the instrument of your isolation from everyone you have known. If my presence in your life brings you more pain than joy, then I will leave. I will return to London and trouble you no more. For I would rather lose you than watch you torn apart by the choice between your own happiness and the approval of others." And Eleanor felt something fierce and hot rise in her chest at his words, a refusal so profound it shocked her with its intensity. For she realized in that moment that she had spent 10 years letting others define her worth and her choices. First honoring Thomas's memory because the village expected eternal devotion, then teaching and serving because it was what a vicar's daughter should do. And now Sebastian was offering her an escape from judgment, but also from the very thing she had fought so hard to claim, the right to live and love and choose for herself. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she had heard it in years. "No, you will not leave and I will not hide. Not anymore. Not ever again. For I have spent a decade in shadows, trying to please the dead and appease the living. And I am finished with both, Sebastian. If they cannot accept that I have chosen life over perpetual mourning, then that is their limitation, not my failing. And I will stand before them all and declare my choice without shame or apology." And she made a decision in that moment that was both terrifying and exhilarating, and that on Christmas morning, when the entire village would gather in street, Catherine's for the celebration of birth and hope and new beginnings, she would appear not in the subdued plum or modest grey that might have been acceptable transitions, but in a dress the color of crimson roses, a declaration of color so bold it could not be mistaken for anything but intentional defiance, a public stand that would force the village to either accept her transformation or condemn her openly rather than through whispered innuendo. And when she told Sebastian of her plan, his eyes widened and then filled with such pride and love that Eleanor felt her resolve strengthen, felt herself becoming the woman she might have been if grief had not claimed her at 20, brave and certain and willing to fight for her own future. The morning after Eleanor wore the crimson dress to Christmas service, creating a scandal that rippled through the village like stone cast into still water, her father summoned Sebastian to the vicarage with a terse note delivered by a wide-eyed stable boy. And when the Duke arrived at the modest study lined with theological texts and smelling of old paper and candle wax, Reverend Ashford stood with his back to the fire, his face grave and worn as though he had not slept, and he said without preamble or the courtesy of offering a seat, "Your Grace, I must speak plainly, for I am a simple man of God, and have no patience for the circumlocutions of your class. And what I must know before this goes any further is whether you love my daughter for herself, or whether you have made a project of her grief, whether you seek to heal her because you care for Eleanor, or because fixing her brokenness makes you feel less broken yourself." And Sebastian felt the words strike him like physical blows, for they cut to the very fear he had harbored in his own heart during sleepless nights. The worry that his love for Eleanor was somehow tainted by his need to redeem himself through saving her. But he met the vicar's eyes steadily and said with a conviction that came from the deepest part of his soul, "Sir, I will not lie and claim I did not first notice Eleanor because of her mourning, for it was impossible not to see a woman so young wearing the garments of perpetual grief. But I fell in love with her, not because she was broken, but because underneath the mourning I saw a spirit of extraordinary strength, a woman who had survived a decade of self-imposed penance and remained capable of kindness and grace. And yes, I wanted to free her from her prison of grief, but not to make myself feel noble or redeemed. I wanted it because watching someone so full of potential life waste away in shadows was unbearable, because every moment she spent in that half-existence felt like a crime against everything beautiful and good in this world. And I love her, Reverend Ashford. I love her fierce loyalty even when it is misdirected. I love her gentle compassion. I love the way she sees through pretense to truth. I love her courage, which she does not even recognize in herself. And I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that I will spend my life not trying to fix her, for she is not broken, but honoring her exactly as she is while supporting her as she becomes whoever she wishes to be. The vicar's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly, and he studied Sebastian with eyes that had counseled parishioners through births and deaths and every crisis in between, and he said quietly, "I have watched my daughter die by degrees for 10 years. Your Grace, I have watched her disappear into grief until I barely recognized the vibrant girl she once was, and I blamed myself for not knowing how to reach her, for being a better shepherd to my flock than to my own child. And then you came with your scandalous reputation and your dramatic gestures, and you did what I could not do. You made her angry enough to feel again. You pushed her until she had to choose between continued death and frightening life. And though your methods were unorthodox and frankly shocking, I cannot deny that for the first time in a decade I saw my daughter truly alive yesterday when she walked into church in that crimson dress with her head held high, defiant and beautiful, and finally herself again, and Sebastian saw tears gathering in the older man's eyes, saw the weight of paternal love and guilt and relief, and the vicar continued, "You have my blessing, Your Grace, reluctant perhaps and certainly conditional upon your continued worthiness of her, but genuine nonetheless, for any man who can love my daughter enough to risk her hatred in order to save her life has proven himself in ways that matter more than reputation or rank or the gossip of small-minded villagers." And when Eleanor entered in the study moments later, summoned by her father, and saw the two men standing together with understanding rather than antagonism between them, she felt something break open in her chest, a final barrier falling away, and she went to her father and embraced him with tears streaming down her face, thanking him for protecting her even when she had not wanted protection, for loving her enough to let her go, for seeing past scandal to the truth of her healing. And her father held her close and whispered that he only wanted her happiness, that he had feared he might lose her forever to grief. But now he could see she had finally found her way home to life, and Sebastian watched father and daughter reconcile and felt his own eyes sting with emotion, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred, the mending of a relationship strained by love and loss and the difficult grace of letting go. On New Year's Eve, as 1,847 prepared to yield to 1,848, Sebastian sent word to Eleanor, requesting she meet him at Ravenmoor Chapel at midnight, the hour when the old year died and the new was born. And though it was unconventional for an unmarried woman to venture out at such an hour, Eleanor wrapped herself in her wool cloak and walked through the snow-dusted lanes under a sky brilliant with winter stars, feeling in her bones that something momentous awaited her in that sacred space where they had first met, when she was still a ghost, haunting her own life, and he was a stranger who saw through her careful performance of perpetual grief, the woman imprisoned beneath. The chapel was warm when she entered, candles lit throughout casting golden light on the ancient stone walls, and Sebastian stood before the altar dressed in formal black, but with none of his usual rakish manner, instead appearing almost vulnerable as he turned at the sound of her footsteps and crossed to take both her hands in his eyes searching her face as though memorizing every detail, and he said in a voice rough with emotion, "Eleanor, when I first came to this chapel I was running from my demons and my past, seeking refuge in a place my father had never sullied with his cruelty, and I found instead a woman in black mourning clothes who looked at me with wariness and something that might have been recognition, for we were both prisoners, though our cells were of different making. And in these months since I have watched you transform from shadow to substance, from half-life to fullness, and I have fallen so deeply in love with you that I cannot imagine my future without you in it, and cannot fathom returning to the empty existence I lived before you, taught me what it means to truly care for another's happiness above my own comfort." And Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as he continued, "I know I am not what anyone would choose for a vicar's daughter. I know my reputation precedes me, and the village whispers about my unsuitability. But Eleanor, I swear to you that I will spend every day of my life proving myself worthy of the gift you would give me by becoming my wife. I will honor you and cherish you, and never ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are. And so I am asking you here, in this chapel, on this threshold between years, will you marry me? Will you take this flawed and previously dissolute Duke and make him the luckiest man in England by agreeing to build a life with me, to fill Ravenmoor with color and laughter and all the joy that has been absent from both our lives for far too long?" Eleanor could not speak for a moment, her throat tight with emotion as she thought about the woman she had been just months ago, wrapped in black fabric and black thoughts, convinced she deserved nothing but shadows and penance, invisible even to herself. And then she thought of this man who had seen her when no one else could, who had cared enough to burn her prison down, even knowing she might hate him for it, who had been patient and fierce and tender by turns, teaching her that she was allowed to want things, allowed to choose life over loyalty to death, allowed to be angry and joyful and complicated and fully human. And she realized that what she felt for Sebastian was not the sweet, uncomplicated affection she had felt for Thomas at 20, but something deeper and more real. A love built not on girlish dreams, but on genuine understanding and hard-won transformation. And she said through her tears, "Yes, Sebastian, yes, I will marry you. For you saw me when I was invisible. You fought for me when I had forgotten how to fight for myself. You gave me back my life, and I want to spend it with you, building something new and beautiful from the ashes of what we both lost." And as the church bells began to toll midnight, marking the birth of 1848, Sebastian pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion and tenderness that made Eleanor feel as though she were being born anew herself, reborn into a life of color and possibility and love that did not ask her to forget her past, but only to refuse to be imprisoned by it. And when they finally drew apart and stood together in the candlelit chapel making plans for a spring wedding, Eleanor felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful, for this man who had burned her mourning dresses, and in doing so had set her free to become whoever she wished to be. And in the weeks that followed, as they shared their news and began preparations and watched the village's grudging acceptance transform into genuine happiness at seeing Eleanor's joy, she sometimes caught Sebastian watching her with an expression of wonder and love that made her understand she had given him a gift as well, had shown him that redemption was possible, that they could both escape the prisons of their past and build a future bright with promise and hope. As spring arrived and the world outside transformed from winter's monochrome palette to an explosion of tender greens and delicate blossoms, Eleanor stood in her bedroom at the vicarage, surrounded by the remnants of her decade-long mourning, the few black garments that had survived Sebastian's purging fire, now laid out on her bed like dark shadows. She was finally ready to banish completely, and she ran her fingers over the severe bombazine and crepe fabrics one final time, remembering the young woman who had first donned them in genuine grief, and the older woman who had clung to them long past necessity, using them as both armor and penance. And then, with a decisive breath, she folded each piece carefully and placed them in a trunk, destined for the parish poor box, a donation that would serve practical purpose for those who genuinely needed mourning clothes rather than those who had made them a prison. The following week, Eleanor traveled to the dressmaker in the neighboring market town with Sebastian beside her in his carriage, and together they selected fabrics in colors she had not worn since before Thomas's death, soft lavenders and rose pinks, deep emeralds and sapphire blues, rich burgundies and golden ambers, each bolt of cloth a revelation as she held it against her skin, and saw how the colors brought warmth to her complexion, where black had only emphasized the pallor of her grief. And Sebastian watched her with such undisguised joy as she deliberated between shades and textures that the dressmaker smiled knowingly and offered cheerful commentary about what would suit a spring bride. Each new dress that arrived over the following weeks felt like a small miracle of transformation, as Eleanor donned colors she had denied herself for so long, and she found herself standing before her mirror, marveling at the stranger who looked back at her, a woman who appeared younger than her 30 years despite the decade of grief, a woman whose eyes held light instead of shadow, whose posture spoke of possibility rather than penance. And sometimes Sebastian would find her simply staring at her reflection with tears on her cheeks, overwhelmed by the reclamation of a self she had thought lost forever. The preparation for their April wedding became not just planning for a ceremony, but a continued journey of Eleanor learning to embrace joy without guilt, to anticipate happiness without the constant whisper that she did not deserve it. And Sebastian proved endlessly patient with her moments of doubt, the times when she would suddenly freeze in the middle of discussing flowers or music, and he would see the old shadows cross her face, and he would simply take her hand and remind her gently that choosing life did not mean dishonoring death, that Thomas would not have wanted her to remain forever frozen in the moment of his loss, that love was capacious enough to hold both gratitude for what was and hope for what would be. On a particularly beautiful afternoon in late March, when the air smelled of apple blossoms and new grass, Eleanor gathered the last of her mourning jewelry, the jet beads and black ribbons, and the locket containing Thomas's portrait that she had worn against her heart for 10 years, and she placed them carefully in a small velvet box which she wrapped with ribbon, and then she and Sebastian walked together to St. Catherine's churchyard, where she knelt beside Thomas's grave and laid the box at the base of his headstone, and she spoke aloud to him for the first time in years, telling him she was sorry for making his death her entire existence, sorry for turning grief into a monument that honored neither his memory nor her own life. And then she thanked him for the love they had shared when they were young, and promised him she would finally let herself be happy. And when she rose, Sebastian was there to take her hand, and together they walked back toward Ravenmoor Estate and the future that awaited them. And Eleanor felt lighter than she had in a decade, unburdened finally from the weight of perpetual mourning, ready at last to step fully into the vibrant, colorful, joyful life she was building, with the man who had loved her enough to burn down her prison, and then wait patiently while she learned to walk free. On a perfect April morning in 1848, when the world seemed to vibrate with the promise of new beginnings, and the air carried the scent of hyacinth and fresh earth, Eleanor stood in her childhood bedroom at the vicarage, wearing a wedding gown of ivory silk embroidered with golden thread that caught the light streaming through the windows. And as her father helped fasten the tiny pearl buttons that ran down her back, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the radiant woman who looked back at her. This bride who bore little resemblance to the ghost in black who had haunted these rooms for a decade. And her father's hands trembled slightly as he worked, and when he finished, he turned her gently to face him and said with tears in his eyes, "You look so much like your mother on our wedding day, so full of joy and hope. And I am sorry I let you hide in shadows for so long when you deserved to live in light." And Eleanor embraced him and whispered that he had only tried to protect her, that she had needed to find her own way back to life. And then together they walked through the spring sunshine to St. Catherine's Church, where the entire village had gathered, filling every pew and spilling out into the churchyard. Their earlier judgment transformed into genuine celebration as they witnessed Eleanor Ashford finally stepping into the happiness she had denied herself for so long. The church was transformed with arrangements of white roses and trailing ivy, and sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting patterns of jeweled color across the stone floor. And when Eleanor entered on her father's arm and saw Sebastian waiting at the altar in his formal black coat with an expression of such profound love and wonder that it made her breath catch, she understood that this moment represented not just a wedding but a resurrection, a choosing of life over death, color over shadow, future over past. And as she walked down the aisle past familiar faces, smiling through tears, she felt the weight of her decade-long mourning finally lift completely, replaced by a lightness that made her feel as though she might float. When she reached Sebastian and placed her hand in his, their eyes met and held, and Eleanor saw reflected in his gaze everything she needed to know about the life they would build together. And the vicar who performed the ceremony spoke of light overcoming darkness, of spring following winter, of resurrection and renewal, choosing readings that emphasized transformation and hope. And when it came time for vows, Sebastian spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the church, promising to honor both the woman Eleanor had been and the woman she was becoming, to cherish her strength and her vulnerability equally, to build with her a life of color and joy and purpose, to never let her retreat into shadows again, but to stand beside her as they both walked forward into light. And Eleanor's own vows trembled with emotion as she promised to choose life every day, to embrace love without fear, to move forward without forgetting but also without being imprisoned by the past, to fill their home with laughter and their days with meaning, and to love Sebastian, not despite his flaws, but because he had seen her truly and loved her enough to fight for her freedom, even when she had forgotten how to fight for herself. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife and Sebastian kissed her with a tenderness that contained also passion and promise, the congregation erupted in applause, and Eleanor heard in that sound not just celebration of a wedding, but acknowledgement of a transformation, the village bearing witness to one of their own, returning from a long exile in grief to claim her place among the living once more. And as she and Sebastian walked back down the aisle as the Duke and Duchess of Ravenmoor, Eleanor's ivory and gold gown catching the coloured light from the stained glass, she felt more herself than she had in 10 years, more whole and present and alive, ready, finally, to embrace whatever joys and sorrows the future might bring, with the man who had burned down her prison and then waited patiently while she learned to build something beautiful from the ashes. 5 years later, in the autumn of 1853, Eleanor stood at the drawing-room window of Ravenmoor Estate, watching the golden afternoon light paint the grounds in shades of amber and copper, and behind her she could hear the delighted shrieks of her 2 children as Sebastian chased them through the corridors in some elaborate game involving dragons and knights, their laughter echoing through rooms that had once been silent and neglected, but now brimmed with the vibrant chaos of a family truly alive. And she smiled at the sound before turning her attention back to the view outside, where the gardens she had helped cultivate over 5 years of marriage bloomed with late-season roses and chrysanthemums in every conceivable color, a deliberate riot of hues that she tended with the same devotion she had once given to maintaining her mourning. Only now her dedication was to life and beauty rather than commemoration of death. Later that afternoon, Eleanor slipped away from the house with a basket of flowers freshly cut from her gardens, and she walked the familiar path to St. Catherine's churchyard, where Thomas's grave stood beneath an ancient oak, its headstone weathered now by 16 years of seasons, and she knelt to arrange the blooms, purple asters and golden dahlias and deep red roses, and as she worked, she spoke softly to the memory of the young man she had loved when she was barely more than a girl, telling him about her children, about Sebastian's kindness and humor, about the life she had built from the ashes of her decade-long mourning. And there was no guilt in her voice now, only a peaceful gratitude for what had been, and an acknowledgement that she had finally learned to honor his memory without being imprisoned by it, that she could carry him gently in her heart while living fully in the present. When Eleanor rose and turned to walk back toward Ravenmoor, she found Sebastian waiting at the edge of the churchyard, their daughter Catherine perched on his shoulders, and their son Thomas, named for the boy who had died so long ago, holding his father's hand. And the sight of them standing there in the autumn sunlight, her family whole and happy and so deeply loved, made Eleanor's heart swell with a joy she had once believed herself unworthy of experiencing. And as she approached, Sebastian reached out his free hand to her and pulled her close, and together they walked home through the falling leaves while the children chatted about the evening ahead, and Eleanor thought about the bonfire that had burned 5 years ago in December, how Sebastian had destroyed her prison of black dresses and then waited with infinite patience while she learned to build something beautiful from the destruction. And she understood now that sometimes the deepest love manifests not in gentle comfort, but in the courage to burn down what keeps the beloved trapped. And she was grateful beyond measure for the sinful Duke, who had seen her when she was invisible even to herself, who had refused to let her waste away in worship of the dead, who had fought for her freedom even when she had fought against him, and who now stood beside her as they raised their children in rooms filled with color and laughter and light, living proof that it was possible to honor grief without being consumed by it, to remember the past without sacrificing the future, to love again after loss, with a depth that only those who have truly mourned can fully comprehend. On a quiet evening in late autumn, 5 years after their wedding, Eleanor found herself standing alone in the gardens of Ravenmoor Estate, where once a bonfire had burned her black mourning dresses to ash, and where now a meticulously tended flower bed bloomed with roses in every shade, from palest blush to deepest crimson, each plant a living testament to transformation and renewal. And as she looked at this garden that had grown from destruction, she thought about the December morning when Sebastian had committed what seemed then like an unforgivable act of violence against her carefully constructed prison, and she understood now that it had been the deepest kind of love, the courage to destroy what kept her captive even when she fought against her own liberation. And she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see her husband approaching through the twilight with their children already settled for the night. And he came to stand beside her and took her hand, and they stood together in companionable silence, looking at the garden that symbolized everything they had built together, from the ashes of their separate sorrows and Eleanor felt moved to speak not just to Sebastian, but to all who might one day hear this story. And so she turned slightly as though addressing someone beyond the garden walls and said, "Dear listener, if you have found yourself in this tale, if you too have worn black for too long, if you too have built a prison from your grief and called it loyalty, know this: there is no betrayal in choosing to live again, no dishonor in allowing color back into your world, no shame in discovering that grief honored need not become grief eternal. And sometimes the greatest act of love we can receive is when someone cares enough to burn down the walls we have built around ourselves, to refuse to watch us waste away in worship of what is gone, to fight for our freedom even when we fight against them. For healing is not a straight path from darkness to light, but a complicated journey that requires both patience and boldness, gentleness and fierce courage, and the wisdom to know when to hold on and when to let go." She paused and looked back at the roses blooming where once her dresses had burned, and continued, "If someone you loved has been gone for years and you have forgotten what it feels like to laugh without guilt, to wear colors without apology, to imagine a future instead of endlessly rehearsing the past, then perhaps this is your permission, your gentle invitation to consider that those we have lost would not wish us to remain forever in shadow, that true love wants the beloved to flourish even in absence, and that there is profound courage in choosing to live fully again after loss, in opening your heart to new joy while still honoring old sorrow, in understanding that you can carry someone tenderly in your memory without carrying them as a burden that crushes all possibility of happiness, and know too that this transformation may require someone who loves you enough to be bold, who sees you truly when you have become invisible even to yourself, who refuses to accept your half-life and demands that you claim your full inheritance of joy and color and passion and purpose." Eleanor's voice grew softer, more intimate, as she concluded, "So may you find the courage to step out of your self-imposed exile. May you discover that life still holds beauty and meaning and love for you if you will only reach for it. May you learn to honor your grief without being consumed by it. And may you build from the ashes of your sorrow something vibrant and true and wholly alive. And may you rest well tonight, knowing that choosing to live again is not forgetting but rather the deepest kind of remembering. For we honor those we have lost most profoundly, not by dying with them, but by living fully in their absence, carrying them gently forward into whatever joy the future may hold. And if this story has touched your heart, if it has given you permission or hope or courage, then share it with someone who might need to hear that grief need not be forever. And remember always that sometimes love means burning down what keeps us imprisoned, and that from those ashes, with patience and courage, we can build gardens that bloom in every color imaginable, testaments to transformation, monuments to the enduring human capacity for renewal, proof that even after the longest winter, spring will come again." And with that, Eleanor turned back to Sebastian, who pulled her close, and together they walked toward their home, where lamplight glowed warm in every window, their children sleeping peacefully upstairs, their future stretching before them vibrant and full of promise, a life built from ashes now blooming in colors she had once believed herself unworthy of wearing, and the story of the vicar's daughter, who wore black for 10 years until the Sinful Duke burned. All her dresses became a story of redemption and resurrection, a reminder that it is never too late to choose life over death and color over shadow, love over fear, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves or receive from another is the courage to begin again.